I'm opening by challenging the assumption that old money are somehow protected from the same collapse we've seen in Post, Hutton, and Duke. The Astors are the perfect subject for this, because for over a century they were the definition of untouchable American aristocracy. The family other families measured themselves against, ending with their own descendant convicted of stealing from his 105-year-old mother lands harder after that setup than a straightforward paradox would. Hook. You probably assume old money families are different, that they built something so solid so early that it just runs on its own forever, generation after generation, untouchable. The Astors would have agreed with you. For over 100 years, they weren't just rich, they were the family that decided who else got to be rich enough to matter, the name behind New York's most famous list, the 400. And in 2009, in a Manhattan courtroom, a jury convicted an 85-year-old man of stealing from his own 105-year-old mother's fortune while she suffered from Alzheimer's. His name was Marshall. Her name, the only name anyone in that courtroom cared about, was Astor. The rise. The story starts with an immigrant, not an aristocrat. A German-born fur trader named John Jacob Astor arrived in New York City in 1784 with almost nothing and an eye for opportunity most of his contemporaries didn't have. He built a fortune first in furs, running trapping and trading operations that stretched deep into the American frontier. But the real genius move came after that. Astor took the money the fur trade generated and poured it into Manhattan real estate, buying up land on an island at the time was still mostly farmland and undeveloped lots north of the city's crowded downtown. Consumer Reports. Ann Seber. That single decision is the entire Astor fortune in one sentence. He wasn't gambling on furs forever. He was using furs to buy dirt. And as New York grew explosively through the 1800s, swelling from a modest port city into the financial capital of a continent, the value of every acre John Jacob Astor had quietly acquired multiplied, and multiplied again. By the time he died in 1848, he was, by some estimates, the richest man in the entire United States, and the fortune he left behind wasn't in furs anymore. It was in land, block after block of it, sitting underneath a city that couldn't stop expanding. His son, William Backhouse Astor, didn't reinvent anything. He simply kept doing what his father had done, buying more Manhattan property, managing the portfolio, and letting the city's growth do the heavy lifting. That's worth pausing on because it's rare in these stories. The second generation didn't shrink the fortune. It grew it patiently by staying inside the same machine the founder had built. And then came the generation that turned money into something else entirely: social power. William Backhouse Astor Jr. married a woman named Caroline Webster Schermerhorn in 1853, and Caroline Astor became, within a couple of decades, the single most powerful gatekeeper in American high society. She and a self-appointed social arbiter named Ward McAllister drew a sharp line between old aristocratic money and the newly rich, insisting that real acceptance required at least 3 generations of wealth behind a family's name. Caroline Astor didn't just attend the important parties, Gilded Age New York. She decided which parties were important, because if Caroline Astor didn't attend yours, it hadn't happened. That list of people she deemed acceptable became famous on its own. They called it the 400, supposedly the exact number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom, and by extension, the exact number of people in America who mattered. Books that slay. Think about what that means for a moment. This wasn't just a rich family anymore. This was a family that had converted money into something even more powerful and even harder to buy: social legitimacy itself, and for a while it looked unbreakable. The monuments. Every dynasty in this genre builds monuments, and the Astors built theirs in stone on some of the most valuable real estate on earth. Caroline Astor's home was filled with French tapestries, Louis XV furniture, and a prized collection of French paintings, a private museum designed to announce, in case anyone doubted it, exactly how far above ordinary wealth this family had risen. Wikipedia. But the monument that tells you everything about this family isn't a house. It's a hotel, and the story behind it is a story about a family feud with a 9-figure price tag. William Waldorf-Astoria, a nephew of Caroline's, grew so resentful of his aunt and her branch of the family that he tore down his own childhood home right next door to Caroline's mansion and put up the Waldorf Hotel in its place, deliberately looming over her house as an act to stopped as real estate development. Caroline and her son fired back by building their own hotel, the Astoria, right beside it. Eventually, cooler heads worked out a truce, and the two buildings merged into a single property, the Waldorf-Astoria, which became one of the most famous hotel names on earth. Wikipedia. It's a remarkable building. It's also, if you look closely, a monument to a family that was starting to fight itself as hard as it fought outsiders for status. William Waldorf-Astoria didn't stop at the hotel. He grew so disgusted with what he saw as America's vulgar, striving culture that he packed up entirely and moved to England, where he eventually rose to the rank of Viscount, an actual title of British nobility. An American family that had spent generations building the closest thing this country had to aristocracy watched one of its own decide that even that wasn't good enough, and left to go buy the real thing overseas. CNN. Ask yourself what that tells you. A fortune that size can build hotels, fund museums, and even purchase entry into a foreign nobility. What it apparently could not buy was peace inside the family itself. Then, in 1912, the Astor name collided with the most famous disaster of the era. John Jacob Astor, the great-grandson of the original John Jacob, died aboard the RMS Titanic, one of the wealthiest men on the ship, drowned along with over 500 other passengers in the North Atlantic. Even the family's tragedies happened on a scale the whole world would remember. Book trib. The mechanism. Here's the pattern worth naming clearly, because it's different from the mechanism we've seen in other collapsed fortunes. Marjorie Post converted money into buildings nobody could afford to keep. Barbara Hutton converted it into marriages that drained it out one settlement at a time. The Astors did something slower and, in a way, more insidious. They converted their fortune into status, into rivalry, into the idea of being an Astor, and across 5 or 6 generations, that status got divided the same way any inheritance does. Every generation split the real estate portfolio further among more heirs. Every family feud, like the one that produced the Waldorf and the Astoria, burned money and energy fighting relatives instead of growing the business. Every heir who left for England, or Wall, or high society itself instead of the actual real estate operation, was one more person who was living off the machine instead of running it. A family name is not a machine. It feels like one, because for 100 years the Astor name opened every door in America. But a name doesn't generate income by itself. It has to be attached to something: land, a company, a working portfolio, and every generation that treated the name itself as the asset, rather than the real estate underneath it, was quietly spending down a fortune that felt bottomless precisely because it had taken a century to build. The Astors didn't lose their money in one dramatic collapse the way Barbara Hutton did. They lost it the way a great river loses its flow, mile by mile, generation by generation, split among more descendants, sold off piece by piece, until the name carried far more weight than the balance sheet behind it. The fall. By the 20th century, the Astor real estate empire had thinned considerably, sold and subdivided across generations, the way every great American fortune eventually gets sold and subdivided. But the final chapter of this story doesn't belong to John Jacob Astor's direct bloodline at all. It belongs to a woman named Brooke Astor, who married into the family, becoming the widow of Vincent Astor, and who inherited control of the Vincent Foundation. Brooke Astor became, in her own right, one of the most beloved philanthropists in American history. Through her late husband's foundation, she is credited with giving New York roughly $200 million, funding institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Public Library, cultural landmarks that still bear the fingerprints of Astor money today. She lived into her hundreds, a living link back to the Gilded Age glamour her husband's family had once defined. And by the early 2000s she was, by most measures, the last great symbol of what the Astor name had meant for over a century. CES News. And then, just like Doris Duke before her, old age and isolation opened the door to exactly the kind of betrayal this entire genre of story keeps circling back to. Brooke Astor's son, Anthony Marshall, was accused of tricking his elderly mother out of millions of dollars and altering her will while she suffered from Alzheimer's disease in her final years. His own son, Philip Marshall, Brooke's grandson, filed court papers in 2006 accusing his father of neglecting her care, an accusation that pulled back the curtain on what prosecutors would later describe in court. Star Tribune. Brooke Astor died in 2007 at the age of 105, and what followed was one of the most closely watched New York had seen in years. Prosecutors laid out how Marshall helped himself to pieces of his mother's estate. Everything from valuable artwork taken off the walls of her home to giving himself a raise of roughly $1 million a year for managing her affairs, all while she was, according to testimony, no longer mentally capable of understanding what she was signing. In October 2009, after it stretched more than 5 months and pulled in witnesses like Henry Kissinger and Barbara Walters, a jury convicted Anthony Marshall on 14 criminal counts, including fraud and grand larceny, and his co-defendant, the estate lawyer who helped forge documents, was convicted alongside him. CBS News. Star Tribune. The case laid bare exactly how much had been at stake, a fortune worth close to $185 million that prosecutors said had been siphoned off through a mix of financial manipulation and outright deception. Marshall, by then in his mid-80s himself, was ultimately sentenced to prison. He fought the conviction through years of appeals before finally surrendering to serve his sentence, and he died in 2014 at 90 years old, the Astor name now permanently attached, in the public record, not to the 400 but to a courtroom and a guilty verdict. NBC News. Think about the distance the family traveled to get there. From an immigrant fur trader who bought up empty Manhattan lots, to a matriarch who single-handedly decided who counted as American aristocracy, to a name so powerful it launched a 9-figure hotel feud, to a courtroom where a jury had to decide, count by count, how much of a dying woman's fortune her own son had quietly taken for himself. That's not a slow fade of an old family losing relevance. That's the exact same mechanism we saw destroy Doris Duke, in miniature, playing out inside the most famous family name in American high society history. The contrast. So what would it have taken to avoid this? Look, once again, at families that solved the exact problem the Astors never did. The Rockefellers, building their fortune in the same era as the Astors, set up structured family trusts and a professional family office starting in the 1930s specifically so no single heir, however trusted, ever held unsupervised control over the whole fortune at once. Every major decision passed through professional oversight, not the goodwill of one relative managing another relative's money behind closed doors. Or look again at Doris Duke's own foundation, the one lesson buried inside her otherwise sad story. When her butler was caught helping himself to her estate, court was able to step in, remove him, and replace him with a board of independent trustees precisely because the structure of a foundation, overseen by a state attorney general's office, existed to catch exactly that kind of theft. Brooke Astor had no equivalent structure standing between her son and her checkbook. She had trust, personal and familial, the same kind of trust that had defined the Astor name for generations. And it turned out to be exactly as fragile as it was for Doris Duke, with a family member instead of an employee on the other side of it. The difference every single time comes down to the same thing. A fortune protected by an institution, a court, a board, a trust with real independent oversight, can survive one person's bad judgment or bad faith. A fortune protected only by a family relationship cannot, because the people closest to you are also the people with the easiest access. The lesson. Here is the lesson sitting underneath more than 2 centuries of Astor history. Being old money doesn't protect a fortune. Being a famous name doesn't protect a fortune. Even having decided, for 100 years, who else in the country was allowed to be considered rich and respectable doesn't protect a fortune. What protects a fortune is the same boring thing it has always been: independent structure, real oversight, and a machine that keeps working long after the people who built it are gone. The Astors, the name. What they never fully built was the wall around it. The callback. Go back to that Manhattan courtroom in October 2009, more than 225 years after a young German immigrant first stepped off a ship in New York with nothing but ambition. A jury of ordinary New Yorkers, the kind of people who would never have made Caroline Astor's 400, and decided that an 85-year-old man had defrauded his own dying mother out of millions. The family that once decided who counted as American aristocracy ended its most public chapter being judged, in the plainest possible terms, by the country it once looked down on. The Fangner. But the Astors, for all their scandal, at least kept a version of their name attached to museums and libraries that still stand today. What happens when an entire fortune, built even faster and even bigger, doesn't fade slowly across 2 centuries, but collapses almost overnight, inside a single generation, taking an entire company and thousands of employees down with it? That is next.